Welcome to The Last Empire, Ancient Mysteries Reveal the Future. We are going to take a fascinating journey to a number of lost civilizations in this series. And we're going to discover some amazing things from the past that show us what the future holds. Let's begin this first program with Secrets of the Lost Scrolls, Buried Myths and Legends. You know, many people today are concerned about what is taking place in the world today. You think about it. Much upheaval has taken place in the Middle East in just recent years. I take tours to the Middle East each year, and I notice that in some countries you can't go there anymore because of the upheaval in the Middle East. Then, of course, there are earthquakes. Just last year I was running this series of programs in the city of Christchurch. What a tragic city that is in terms of the fact that its heart has been ripped out, and an amazing, resilient people living in the city of Christchurch. But people are concerned, scientists are worried about these things. And then, of course, we have tsunamis. You know, I also travel to the islands of the Pacific nations. And just early this year, I was out in the Cook Islands, and I noticed around the island there were signs marking the escape routes in case there was a tsunami. In fact, I was even in Kiribati just this year too, and I noticed that they took me to the highest mountain in the Kiribati Islands, 3 metres above sea level. You sure wouldn't want to be there when a tsunami struck. But these things concern many people today. And then, of course, there's climate change and global warming ticking away in the background silently, but having an effect on our environment and our lifestyles as time goes on. Of course, there's international conflicts. And in fact, in many places around the world, there are international conflicts that are taking place. In fact, someone estimated somewhere around about 20 to 30 international conflicts every year for the last decade, they once said. And then, of course, we have the fragile global economic situation. Nations are borrowing money by the billions of dollars. And economists know that we're living in a house of cards. And because of these things, people are asking a very serious question. What does the future hold? You know, you think of that word predictions or prophecies. You go home and or while you're at home, you type that word in, prophecy. I did it a number of times, and I noticed on one occasion 37 million hits. You see, because people want to know, what does the future hold? In fact, you know, you think of the column centimetres in our newspapers and tabloid magazines for the psychics. The column centimetres have been growing over the years because people want to know, what does the future hold? You know, I was down here in India, in Benares, on the mighty Ganges River just a few years ago. And this is a sacred place to the Hindu people. They come to take a sacred bath in the Ganges River. And I noticed right here in this place, someone had set up their astrology shop. Because people down there also want to know, what does the future hold? This is a very important question that is around many places in the world today. I was in Bangkok, and I noticed someone had set up their palm reading little stand. Because people want to know, what does my future hold? What is going to take place in the future? Now, you remember just a couple of years ago, 2012, the world was supposed to end in December 2012 because of the Mayan calendar and the end of the world and all those predictions that were being made. But actually, what happened in 2012? Well, nothing happened. You see, my point is, it's very hard to tell the future. It's not easy. Many people were doing it, but actually nothing happened. Some of you will remember well the year 2000, when many different predictions were made about what was going to take place in the world at that time. But again, what happened? Well, nothing happened. We're still here. The point is, it's not easy to predict the future. Not easy at all. In fact, These Times magazine, some years ago, ran an interesting article. They surveyed some of the predictions of the psychics. They noticed that 6 out of 250 predictions were actually correct. That's just 3%. You could guess at it, and do just as good when you stop and think about it. Now, my point is this: it's not easy to predict the future. In fact, they also noticed that the average leading psychic's accuracy, his batting average, or their batting average, is about 16%. In other words, for every 100 predictions that are made by the leading psychics, only 16 are correct. Again, it's not easy to predict the future. Well, that leads us to an important question. Can we actually know the future? Is it possible to predict the future? Well, there are two essentials that you would need if you want a source that is reliable for knowing the future. Number one, you would need something that has historical accuracy. In other words, we're not dealing with myths and legends. So something that has substance under our feet. That's the first thing you'd want. Second thing is you would want a source that has a proven track record of dependable predictions. In other words, do the predictions actually happen? Again and again they're fulfilled. For example, if I said to you, look, tomorrow the stock price, the prices for the shares of Qantas are going to go through the roof by lunchtime tomorrow. And so sell everything you have in the morning and buy Qantas shares as soon as you can before lunchtime, because they're going to go through the roof. You're not going to go and sell everything you have to buy Qantas shares first thing in the morning unless you know a little bit about, number one, me. Do I have a track record in the stock market of proven predictions? Have the predictions that I've made actually come to pass? You're also going to want to do a bit of study when it comes to the trends of the shares of Qantas. Otherwise, you might be buying something which is going to send you to the wall. And so you see, we need a proven track record when we are looking at a source for telling the future. Now, is there such a source? Well, absolutely there is. And in this series of programs, and especially in this program, I'm going to give you the evidence of a source whose predictions are dependable and reliable. Well, as we go through this program and the ones to come, we're going to be using two things side by side so that we can see a dependable source for knowing the future. We're going to be looking at ancient history, the historical records, and we're going to be having a look at what the archaeologists have discovered. What has been found as the archaeologists dig up the sands. Let's first of all talk a little bit about what archaeology is. Now, in archaeology, we simply dig up the past, if we can put it that way. You see, in the ancient world, people tended to build on little hills generally. I mean, obviously, this is a better place to be able to defend oneself from when you're on the top of a hill. Of course, you're above the floodplain. Now, so we have a village on top of a hill, and let's say an earthquake strikes the city or the village. The city will be destroyed and the people will have to flee perhaps, but when they come back, they will not bring in the bulldozer for obvious reasons. What they will do is they will just bring in some fill up to the lowest point they can possibly have as base, bring in the fill, and then build on top. Now let's say 100 or 200 years go by and an army comes through and attacks that city. And it destroys much of it in a fire and so on. Much of it's going to be destroyed, and when the people come back again, they'll bring in more fill and build on top of that. And so the hill is growing over time, as you can appreciate. So when an archaeologist digs, he's digging up time. The deeper he goes, or the deeper they go, the older that civilization is. In fact, if you go to the Middle East today, to say Jerusalem, you can visit the city of Jerusalem, and when you're walking on the streets of Jerusalem today, you will notice that you are about 6 or 7 metres above the level 2,000 years ago. In fact, you can walk down some steps to the level of about 20 feet or 6 or 7 metres, and you'll be down at 2000 BC, 2,000 years ago, I should say. So the civilization mound has grown over time. We call this a tell, as you can see on the screen, a T-E-L. Here's an example of a tell. This is Tel Megiddo in Israel today. There's quite a number of civilizations built one on top of the other here. In fact, you can see in this picture on the right bottom corner, there's an area where the archaeologists have been digging, and then just above it, where those green lights are, there's another level of that civilization, of another civilization built on top. So archaeologists are digging up time. Now, they find many things, of course, when they dig. They don't usually find something like this little cylinder here. This is called the Nabonidus cylinder, a king who's mentioned in ancient records. They don't usually find something like this, but they do find lots of broken pottery. And pottery is very important to the archaeologists because it helps them to date where they are as they're digging down. Now, let me illustrate it this way. Just as dress styles change through time, and if we have a lady who may be a dress expert here today, she can look at just the back of a dress and tell you, oh, that's a 70s dress, or that's from the 1700s, that particular dress. Or perhaps it's a guy who's an expert on cars. He doesn't need to see the whole car. Sometimes all he needs to see is the back bumper bar, and he can say, that's from the 50s, or that's from the 40s. And so, because car styles and dress styles change through time, we can use those things to date. Now, when it comes to archaeologists, because pottery styles also changed through time, so too we can use pottery to date where we are as we're digging down. So a pottery expert, all he needs is the top of the rim of a cup or some sort of a vessel, or even the bottom, just the top or the bottom, just a piece of that, and he can tell you, oh, we're at 700 BC, and he'll only be within about 50 years out. So this is how archaeologists date where they are as they're digging. Now let's talk for a moment about archaeologists' most important discoveries, and there have been a number of them, but these are the three most important. Let's come, first of all, to that magnificent land of the Nile. We want to go to Egypt right now, and many people have been travelling to Egypt for centuries. There are some amazingly awesome monuments in Egypt that one can see, like the Colossi of Memnon in Luxor, or the beautiful mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut at Dur el-Bahri, also in Luxor. And then, of course, there are the mighty pyramids. In fact, that's what most people think about when they think about the land of Egypt. Now, I want you to think for a moment about these great pyramids, which are the burial places for just one man, usually. Now, this is Khufu's pyramid, or Cheops pyramid. It's about 150 metres high. It's really like a mountain of stone when you think about it. In fact, there's about 2 million stones, it's estimated, in this one pyramid of this great king of Egypt. In fact, if you cut the stones from this one pyramid into 30 centimetre cubes, so here we have 30 centimetre cubes of the stone of that pyramid's cut up like that, and you put them end on end, they will go around Australia more than twice from just one pyramid. That's how huge this thing is. In fact, I want you to think, if this thing was hollow, this is the volume of this one pyramid. By the way, you will notice at the top of this pyramid here that there was once white Tura limestone that covered the whole of the outside of the pyramid. Now, these are the buildings you could fit inside this one pyramid if it was empty. You could fit in the magnificent Muhammad Ali Mosque from Cairo, and alongside it you could also fit in the Notre Dame Cathedral from Paris. Then there'd also be room for St. Peter's of London, of Rome I should say, and St. Paul's of London. These buildings would also fit inside this amazing pyramid. Added to that, we could fit in the Colosseum from Rome as well, which is a magnificent building, a huge volume. So all these buildings could fit in the one pyramid at the same time. That's how vast this structure is. Now, the pyramids, as we said, were just a mountain of stone. But it's in Egypt that we find the most important discovery, or one of the most important discoveries. It was in 1798 that Napoleon Bonaparte, the great French leader, came here to Egypt in 1798 to a place called Rosetta in the Delta. And while his soldiers were digging in the Delta region, they came across this interesting stone here, known today as the Rosetta Stone. Now you will notice this stone is in three sections. The top section of this stone is what we call Egyptian hieroglyphic writings. Then the second section is in the cursive Egyptian script called the Demotic script. And finally, the bottom section is the Greek language. Now, they guessed rightly that this was an inscription in three different languages. And these languages were telling the same story. Now, they knew the Greek language, so they could work from the known language to the unknown language at the top, the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, it took them about 20 years, thanks to a brilliant Frenchman by the name of Jean-Francois Champollion mainly. And Champollion worked on this thing for 20 or so years, and finally he was able to announce to the world that he could read the Egyptian hieroglyphic writings. Now, what was the significance of this? Well, the significance was this. You see, written all over the tombs and the temple walls in Egypt was this hieroglyphic language, but no one knew what it meant. But now they could read the writing, and they could learn about the Egyptian religion, the Egyptian history, the Egyptian culture. And so as they did this, they were able to unlock ancient Egypt and all that went with it. So you can see this was a very important discovery indeed. The second discovery, we must travel to Iran now. When we go to Iran, we come to a fascinating place known as Behistun. And Behistun, there is a huge cliff, and high on the cliffs a number of inscriptions have been made. One of these, called the Behistun inscription, has a very interesting inscription on it in three languages again. This was put here by Darius the Great, a great Medo-Persian king who had this inscription made. And because they knew one of the languages, they were able to work from the known language again, just like with the Rosetta Stone, from the known language to the unknown, and now they were able to decipher what we call the cuneiform script, which is the script that was used in Mesopotamia. That whole region, the Sumerians were there, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and many of the nations in the cradle of civilization there in Mesopotamia, or what we call Iraq today, this was their language. In fact, it's this little cylinder here that I have that's actually written in the cuneiform script. And so this was the language of the Mesopotamian peoples, the written language. But no one knew what all that writing meant until the Behistun inscription. And thanks to a British man by the name of Henry Rawlinson, a British soldier who saw this inscription and one or two others in Mesopotamia, he was able to decipher this great language or written language of these ancient people in the centre of the then known world. So, as a result of that discovery, we are now able to read all these cuneiform tablets. These tablets, of course, are just clay, pieces of clay, and they were wet and they wrote in them and then dried them in the sun or baked them. So we have whole libraries of these cuneiform tablets, some 20,000 volumes in one library alone. And now the archaeologists and the historians were able to unlock the culture, the religion, and the history of the people of the Mesopotamian region. So again, a very important discovery was made there in Iran. The last of the three most important discoveries was found at the Dead Sea in Israel. At a place called Qumran on the northwestern edge of the Dead Sea, a young Bedouin boy, so the story goes, was minding his clan's goats with one of his friends when one of the goats that they were minding strayed up into the area of some cliffs. Now the boys, in an endeavour to get the goat back, threw a stone at the goat. They missed, and the stone went into one of the caves, and there are many caves in this region, and when it went into the cave they heard the sound of breaking pots. These boys, of course, thought, there's treasure up there, so they raced up to those caves, but to their dismay, all that they found in that cave were some old pots, and in those pots some very old scrolls. And no doubt these boys were disappointed, but the Bedouin clan that they belonged to, they took these scrolls up, took them to Bethlehem, where they sold them to an antiquities dealer by the name of Kando in Bethlehem. And he purchased them for $100 US, would you believe? Now, of course, just a few years after that, those same scrolls, just like that, were selling for $500,000 US. That's inflation, of course. Wouldn't mind being on the end of that, would we? But, of course, today those same scrolls are priceless. You just wouldn't be able to purchase them today. This collection of scrolls, of course, is known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. The question is, why are they so valuable? What's the significance of these old scrolls that they are worth so much today? Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, these things are very old, and of course anything that's old seems to be valuable. We value old things. Now, these scrolls were dated by a number of means. First of all, the style of the script. You see, just as pottery styles change through time, just as that changed, so did the style of the script change through time. For example, if you read English, you try reading English of the 16th century. It's a lot harder, a lot different than it is today. The S's are F's and so on. Not easy, because script styles change through time. Well, the ancient people, their scripts changed as well. So the style of the script showed how old it was. They did radiocarbon dating on some of these scrolls as well. And the radiocarbon dating, of course, helped them to date the scrolls to actually the same time. And finally, they even discovered some old coins with some of these scrolls. And so those three things helped them to date these things. And they were dated to 100 to 200 BC. 100 to 200 years before the time of Christ. So they were very old scrolls, as you can appreciate. Well, what were these scrolls? Well, they consisted of a number of things. First of all, they consisted of documents that outlined the rules of the community who wrote these scrolls. They were a group of Jewish monastics living there at the Dead Sea. They're the rules of how they lived and so on. But 1/3 of these documents actually were some of every book of what we call the Old Testament part of the Bible, except the book of Esther and the book of Nehemiah. So the Old Bible, that was there, the Old Testament part. In fact, it's this part that contains the ancient predictions that have a proven track record that we're going to see during this series. The predictions are contained in these Dead Sea Scrolls. The third thing about these scrolls was that the old biblical records, or the Bible that we have, you may see in a motel or you have at home somewhere, it hasn't changed through the centuries. You see, scholars thought this. They thought that surely, if someone copies the original document, and then someone copies the copy of the original, and then someone copies the copy of that, and so on down through time, that surely you're going to introduce a whole heap of mistakes. That was the theory, you see. Well, they had a way of checking this now, because up to this point in time, the oldest documents they had were about 900 AD, 1,000 years later, of the Old Testament. You see, it's like this. You've played the game of Chinese whispers, as I have as a little kid. You whisper something in someone's ear and you pass it around the room, you know what happens. By the time we get to the last person and they whisper it back to me, you know that the thing has changed significantly from how it began. And so that's what they thought. Surely, as we copy and copy and copy down through the centuries, we'll introduce significant mistakes. But when they did this, when they compared the oldest that they had now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, with the oldest up to before that point, they found that for all intents and purposes, the biblical records haven't changed. In fact, the Bible that you pick up in a motel or that you have in your home, it is essentially the same as what we have way back then. And we know now why this is the case, because the scribes, the Jewish scribes, were very particular in the way they copied their manuscripts. For example, they would do word counts on these documents and count up the words. And if they found that the words didn't tally right, they would sometimes screw the whole thing up and start again. Now, you imagine, would you, if you get to the last paragraph in a book, one of the scrolls was 9 meters long. Imagine you get to the last paragraph and you make a mistake. Start all over again. Well, you can see the point. They were very particular, and this is why mistakes were not introduced. All right, now let's go back now, having seen what archaeologists do and the most important discoveries which help us unlock the past, so to speak. Let me give you the evidence for the historical accuracy of these writings, because this is the first thing we need if we want to have a document that we can depend on for understanding the future. Now, I'm going to begin by looking at one of the greatest archaeologists of our age, W.F. Albright. Who was W.F. Albright? Well, as I said, one of the greatest archaeologists of our age. He was the author of over 800 works on archaeology and related topics. And not only that, but he was the director of the American School of Oriental Research. So, in other words, he's no fool. He knows his business. Now, this is what W.F. Albright says about the biblical records, and then I'm going to give you the evidence as to why he says this. He said, "In the center of history stands the Bible. Thanks to modern research, that's archaeological studies, we can now recognize its substantial historicity, its historical accuracy. To sum it up," he says, "we can now treat the Bible from beginning to end as an authentic document of religious history." In other words, it's not fairy tales, myths and legends, he says. Now let's have a look at why he says that by going to some ancient civilizations together. As we look at some of the amazing discoveries in lost civilizations, we're going to go to the great civilizations in Petra, the Hittite peoples, and we're going to go to the terrorists of the ancient world as well. But let's begin with Petra. Some of you have no doubt been to Petra, or certainly seen pictures and programs on Petra, a city carved out of rock. Now, Petra is located just south of the Dead Sea and just north of the Gulf of Aqaba, as you can see on that map there with the arrows pointing there. Now, it was in 1812 that a Swiss explorer by the name of Johann Ludwig Burckhardt was about to take a journey from Damascus in Syria down to Cairo in Egypt. Now, Burckhardt was believed to have converted to the Islamic faith, and he was certainly very fluent with the Muslim culture, and he understood Arabic writing and so on. He's on his way to Cairo, and he's got a guide with him who's going to take him there. As the guide and Burckhardt travelled along, the guide started to tell Burckhardt about an amazing place carved out of rock, and Burckhardt immediately recognised this as the place that had vanished for over 900 years. Nobody knew where this place was. The last they'd heard of it was around about the time of the Crusaders, some 800 years before. And his ears pricked up, and his curiosity got the better of him, and he wanted to visit this place. Now, the guide showed him, or told him as they journeyed, that this place was near Mount Hor. Now, what's Mount Hor? Well, you'll notice on this next picture here, we have this mountain here, and up the top, if you look carefully, there's a little white dot right there in the middle. This is Mount Hor. Now, Mount Hor was the burial place for Abraham. For Aaron. You know, Moses had a brother called Aaron, and Aaron is very famous, like Moses is, to both the Jewish people and the Muslim people. And so Burckhardt came up with an ingenious plan. He said to his guide, he said, "Listen, I want to offer a special sacrifice in honor of Aaron up at Mount Hor. He knew this was near Petra, or at least the way that God was describing it. He said, listen, would you take me to Mount Hor so I can offer my sacrificial goat in honor of Aaron? Now, no good Muslim will deny a fellow brother in the Islamic faith such a privilege. And so the guide said he would take him there. Well, they came eventually to Wadi Musa, which is just outside of this area called Petra, where Petra is. And another guide took Burkhardt to Petra itself. And you can imagine, Burkhardt became very interested now as they travelled down this wadi, this dry riverbed, and they started to move downhill. And as they travelled, they saw these buildings starting to emerge from the rocks as well there. And the further down they went, the narrower this wadi got, and so soon it was just a cleft or a seek between these great cliffs. And these cliffs were towering about 100 metres above Burkhardt and his guide as they travelled along. You can see how high these things are. Way up there above them, 100 metres high, are these cliffs on either side. Just a narrow cliff as they wind their way through here in towards Petra. Well, as they came toward the end, a building started to emerge at the end of this seek or cleft between the rocks, and as they came out of it, there was this magnificent building known as El Khazna, or the Treasury. It's the facade of a building that has been carved out of the rocks here in Petra. And what a magnificent thing it is, the Treasury. Well, Burkhardt and his guide soon spread out across the valley floor and saw all sorts of buildings, such as houses and tombs carved out of the rock. They journeyed further. You can see a magnificent temple. And you can see how high it is. Just notice the door at the bottom. A man is trying to climb in through the bottom, at the bottom of this great building. It's a humongous thing that has been carved away from this sandstone rock. Well, the guide began to get suspicious. I thought you came to offer a goat in honor of Aaron, he thought. And he pulled his rifle out and threatened to shoot Burkhardt, who decided it's time to get out of here. He offered his goat up in honor of Aaron, and he took off out of there with his guide and announced to the world that they had discovered Petra. Well, this is a fascinating place to visit. The first inhabitants of Petra, it's believed by scholars to be the Edomites. Now, who were the Edomites? Well, you may recall in the history of the ancient stories of the Jewish people that the father of the Jewish people was a man by the name of Abraham. Now, Abraham had a son called Isaac, and Isaac had two sons called Esau and Jacob. Jacob became the father of the Israelite people, and Esau became the father of the Edomites. And the Edomites, it's believed, settled in Petra around 1900 BC. So you can see these are cousins of the Israelites in actual fact. Now, the Edomites settled on this hill right in the middle of Petra, known as el-Bayara. El-Bayara means the place of the cisterns, because up on top of this great hill, the Edomites carved some great receptacles for the water. It doesn't rain much in these parts, and when it does rain, the water ran down channels into these great cisterns that you can see today here in Petra. Now, the word Sela is Hebrew for rock. In the Greek language, that word is Petra. And so it's believed this rock is what gives Petra its name. This great rock in the middle, el-Bayara. Now, the biblical prophets spoke about Petra. You go to the book of Jeremiah, one of the men whose writings was in the Dead Sea Scroll collection. And Jeremiah mentions this place. Let me read it to you from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 49, verse 16. It says in the ancient biblical records, "You Edomites who live in the clefts of the rocks," that's between that narrow passageway that went into Petra, "who occupy the heights of the hill," believed to be el-Bayara, that rock in the middle. But not only Jeremiah spoke about this place, but so did the prophet Obadiah around the same time period, 600 BC. Notice what Obadiah said in his writings as well. He said, "The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights, who say to yourself, 'Who can bring me down to the ground?' Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, says the Lord." So here are these two prophets, Jeremiah and Obadiah, 600 BC, wrote about this place. And what we're seeing here then is the historical accuracy. Just as archaeologists have found this place between the clefts of those great rocks, so these prophets had mentioned this place and the great rock in the middle, it is believed. This is one example of the historical accuracy. This is not myths and legends. Here's another one. Let's come to the Louvre Museum in Paris, a fascinating museum to visit. A discovery was made in the area of Moab. You notice just north of Edom, where the Edomites lived, is the land of Moab, in Jordan today. And some years ago, a man discovered this stone, found this stone. It's known today as the Moabite stone or the Mesha Stele, about 9th century BC. Now, the biblical prophets mentioned Mesha. And I want you to notice what the Bible prophets said in their writings, and then we'll compare it with the Mesha or the Moabite stone. So let's notice what it says here in the book of Kings. Now, Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep master, and he had to pay the king of Israel, Omri, the wool of 100,000 lambs and of 100,000 rams. This guy must have been a Kiwi. So many sheep all over the place. But it came to pass when Ahab, son of Omri, was dead, that the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel, whose name was Jehoram, the son of Ahab. So this is the biblical description of this event. Now let's go to the Moabite stone in the Louvre Museum. Notice what it says on the Moabite stone. "I am Mesha, king of Moab," it says. "Omri, king of Israel, had oppressed Moab many days, but I have triumphed over his house." In other words, I rebelled against him. You notice this is very similar to what the Bible writers had written. And that's what Albright's talking about. It's historically accurate. It's not myths and legends. It is a trustworthy source of information, in other words. Well, let's come to another example. Let's come to the Hittite country. We want to go now to Turkey. The Hittites are mentioned over 40 times in the biblical records. Now, here's one example of the Hittites. It says here in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 7 and verse 6, the Bible says, "Look, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to attack us." Now, you may recall that a very famous city in Israel, or at least a dangerous city in Israel, is known as Heshbon. Sorry, not Heshbon. Hebron, I should say. Hebron is a very important place to both Jews and Muslims because this is the place where Abraham is buried. Abraham is buried here because he bought a field from the Hittites to bury his wife in, and later on he was buried here as well. So the Hittites are mentioned many times in the biblical records. But let's notice what we find in history. Now, if you go to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the 1840s edition, you will only find about 8 lines on the Hittites. And most of those 8 lines, pretty well all of it, comes from the biblical records. And because the biblical records are the only place where you find mention of the Hittites until later on, more recent times, historians said the Bible is wrong. This is a mistake, this is a myth, this is a legend, this is not true. We've never found any mention of these people except in the Bible, and so the Bible's wrong. Well, then the archaeologists got to work, and they discovered whole cities that belong to the Hittite people, such as Hattusa here. You need a bus to get around this place. It's just so vast. Great capital of the Hittite peoples there in central Turkey. You can see, you can enter the city through the mighty Lion Gate as well. Just up the road a little bit, there is a temple area. and you see the kings and the gods and so on, here the great symbols of the Hittite peoples. So we know these people existed from history now. In fact, when you go to Abu Simbel, which is up there on the Aswan Dam in Egypt, you can see the great temple of Ramesses II. He was a great pharaoh, this man. He had about 200 kids and 70 wives. He'd have to be a great man to have all that, wouldn't he? Well, here is a temple belonging to Ramesses II, and inside we see this scene where Ramesses II is fighting the Hittites, because now we can read the Egyptian hieroglyphs. So again, we can see these people certainly existed. In fact, we now have an Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty between Hattusili III and Ramesses II. So no question today, these people existed, but the Bible said that so long ago. It mentioned this detail. In fact, we know the Hittite peoples rivaled the Assyrians and rivaled the Egyptians. They were a great superpower. In fact, the Bible was correct. So this is what Albright was meaning when he said it's historically accurate. It's not myths and legends. So archaeology clearly reveals the Bible is historically accurate. Its information is indeed trustworthy. And so in our first session of The Last Empire, Ancient Mysteries Reveal the Future, we have seen, first of all, that here is a document, the biblical records, that fulfill the first criteria if you want to know the future. It's historically accurate. It's not myths and legends. Now, in our second program in our series, we're going to have a look at, well, what about the proven track record? Do the biblical records have a proven track record of fulfilled predictions? Or do they have a batting average of 16% or something? What's the track record like? That's what we want to examine in our second program in our series, The Prophetic Code, Ancient Mysteries Reveal the Future. So join us in our second part of our series as we have a look at what sort of a track record. Then we're going to be able to see some of these amazing things that talk about the future, not just in the past, predictions about the past, but predictions concerning our own day. So we look forward to joining you in this second program in our series.